I'm Jeff Brown, and welcome to the wide world of cinema. It's Sunday, May 17th, 2026. Today, theaters are playing familiar things: sequels, reboots, safe bets, movies engineered to open big and disappear 2 weeks later. But this afternoon, for some reason, my curiosity pulled me somewhere else. An hour drive, a Chinese political thriller from China Film Group Corporation, Cold War 1994, about the handover of Hong Kong, corruption, power, crime, and political intrigue. And the moment I walked into the theater in Houston, Texas, I noticed something immediately. I was the only black person in the room, maybe the only non Asian person in the room. And instead of asking myself, why am I here? I started wondering, why aren't more people here? Because over the last year and a half, I've discovered something. Some of the most fascinating storytelling I've encountered hasn't been coming from Hollywood at all. It's been coming from faraway places like India, China, Japan, Korea, Pakistan, Vietnam. Different rhythms, different myths, different emotional languages. And somewhere between the silence of a Hong Kong political thriller and the explosive musical emotion of Indian cinema, I realized I wasn't just watching movies anymore. I was encountering other ways of seeing the world. But honestly, my relationship with international cinema probably started decades ago. I remember being stationed in Korea in the late 1990s and going to see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon in a sold out theater in Chuncheon, Korea, with a friend who was learning to speak English. And what stayed with me wasn't just the movie, it was the experience. The smell of dried squid instead of popcorn, kimchi instead of nachos, a completely different rhythm inside the theater. And I remember realizing, maybe for the first time, that cinema just doesn't change from country to country. The experience of cinema changes too. And walking out of that theater, I remember thinking that might have been the best movie I'd seen all year. And back then, films like that were still treated almost like they existed in a separate category from Hollywood films. Foreign films weren't really allowed into the same conversation. But now, the world has changed. International cinema has become impossible to ignore. And maybe that experience in Korea planted a seed that followed me all the way here, years later, sitting in a theater in Houston, Texas, watching another story from another culture unfold in front of me. And one thing that's important to understand about me before we go any further is this: I watch a lot of movies, not casually, not occasionally. That is part of my life now. On average, I probably see 7 to 10 movies a week, sometimes more. Sometimes I go back and watch the same film multiple times. I'm usually in a theater almost every day. And almost everything I talk about on this channel was experienced in a movie theater first. Not on a phone, not half paying attention at home, not while folding laundry or scrolling social media. In the theater. Because one thing I've started realizing is that the environment in which we encounter cinema matters almost as much as the movie itself. The audience matters, the sound matters, the screen size matters, the collective rhythm of the room matters. And over time, going to the movies stopped being casual for me. It became a process. Not just what movie I chose to see, but when I see it, where I see it, what kind of audience I see it with, even what time of day I experience it. Because all of that changes the movie. A movie at 1 o'clock in the afternoon with 12 people scattered across the theater feels completely different than the exact same film in a sold out nighttime screening. Sometimes I intentionally go in the middle of the day because I want quiet, I want space, I want to observe, I want to sit with the movie and my own thoughts. Other times, I deliberately seek out packed houses because I want to feel the collective reaction, the laughter, the tension, the silence, the anticipation. Sometimes I go alone because solitude sharpens observation. Other times I'll go with my friend, a retired symphony cellist, because she hears things musically that I may completely miss. She notices emotional rhythm differently, instrumentation differently, the way music shapes pacing and tension. Some of the most fascinating conversations I've had about cinema happened walking out of theaters with someone who spent a lifetime performing music at that level. She'll point out things like how certain Indian films use triplet patterns and rhythmic repetition in ways that create emotional propulsion completely different from most American scoring traditions. And once somebody points that out to you, you can't unhear it. That's another thing international cinema reveals. Different cultures don't just tell stories differently, they score emotion differently too. And after years of doing this, I've realized something. Movie going itself is part of the art form. The theater is not just a container for the movie, it's part of the experience. The audience changes the rhythm, the room changes the tension, the environment changes what lands emotionally. And that's one reason I keep coming back to theaters over and over again instead of simply watching everything at home. Because cinema at its best is not just something you watch, it's something you enter. And in a strange way, the rules have reversed. Years ago, I was the foreigner in Korea, discovering another culture through cinema. Now, I was home in America, sitting in a theater full of people for whom this story, this language, this emotional rhythm may have felt deeply familiar. And there I was again, the outsider, the observer, the curious one. And I remember one time walking into a Korean historical film, The King's Warden. As I came into the theater, this older Korean woman looked at me and then quietly followed me with her eyes as I walked all the way across the theater, up the stairs, and sat a few seats away from her. And after a moment, she just smiled like, okay, so you're here for this too. And honestly, I think moments like that matter more than we realize. Because it's one thing to say you watch international films casually at home on Netflix or Prime Video while you're folding laundry or checking your phone. It's another thing entirely to deliberately drive across a city, buy a ticket, sit in a theater, and commit yourself for 2 hours to another culture's language, emotional rhythms, humor, music, fear, and mythology. Even if you don't speak the language, you're still listening to it. You're sitting with it. You're allowing another culture to tell you a story in its own voice instead of forcing it to speak in yours. And for those 2 hours, everyone in that theater, immigrants, first generation Americans, lifelong Texans, people born here, people born somewhere else, we all agreed to do the same thing: sit down together in the dark and to listen. Now, I'm sure their experience of the movie was very different from mine. Some of the references probably landed differently. Some of the emotions probably hit deeper. Some moments probably carry cultural weight I can't fully understand. But that's okay, because that's what cinema is supposed to do. Stories are one of the oldest things human beings have ever shared. Before nations, before borders, before politics, before even written language. People gathered together to tell stories around fires, through paintings, through songs, through oral history. There's something about storytelling that briefly makes strangers part of the same experience. For a little while, everybody listens together. And then another thing quietly starts happening while you're watching these films. You realize how much your own sense of beauty, style, sophistication, and glamour has been shaped almost entirely through an American lens. Because growing up in America, Hollywood becomes the default visual language. The celebrities, the fashion, the standards of attractiveness, the way power looks, the way success looks, the way romance looks and feels. And then you sit down and watch a film from another culture, and suddenly you're seeing an entirely different aesthetic world unfold. Different faces, different styles, different body language, different tailoring, different ideas of elegance, masculinity, femininity, status, professionalism, and beauty. And what's fascinating is that none of it feels lesser. In fact, a lot of it feels incredibly sophisticated, stylish, and dare I say, cinematic. The actors are charismatic, the women are beautiful, the men carry presence and authority, the fashion is sharp, the cities feel alive and modern. And you realize that American media doesn't necessarily show us the full visual richness of the rest of the world. Because cinema is more than storytelling. Cinema is also a reflection of what a culture admires, what it finds beautiful, what it finds powerful, what it considers elegant, what it chooses to mythologize. And sitting there watching this film, it becomes impossible not to notice that every culture creates its own visual language of beauty and identity. But probably the most profound realization I had in that theater had nothing to do with politics, cinematography, or even culture. It was acting. I've spent more than 30 years on stage as an actor. I'm an equity actor. And somewhere in the middle of watching this film, it suddenly hit me. The men and women on that screen belong to the same profession, the same artistic brotherhood that I devoted a large part of my life to. And despite the distance between us, thousands of miles, different languages, different histories, different cultures, I realize they probably understand the same exact anxieties, hopes, and rituals that actors everywhere understand. The audition, waiting to hear if you booked the role, getting the call from an agent, the excitement and fear of the first day on set, wanting the performance to feel truthful, worrying if you're good enough, hoping you don't get replaced, wondering if your scenes will survive the final cut. And sitting there in a movie theater in Texas, watching actors from halfway across the world, I suddenly realized how small the world actually is. Because no matter the country, actors are still chasing the same thing: truth, connection, presence, belief. And there was something deeply moving about recognizing a shared artistic language that never needed to be spoken out loud to be understood. Maybe that's another thing cinema does at its best. It quietly reminds us that artists everywhere are participating in the same ancient act, trying to tell human stories honestly. And honestly, Cold War 1994 felt like it was trying to tell an honest story. Now, I don't know enough about Hong Kong politics or the historical realities behind everything in the film to judge how accurate every detail was, but sincerity is something you can feel. The intent of the director was there, the commitment of the actors was there. The world felt lived in, the tension felt believable, the relationships felt real. And maybe that's something you become more sensitive to after watching as many movies as I do, after years of acting, After spending decades around storytelling and performance, you start recognizing when a film feels authored instead of manufactured. Not engineered for clicks, not built around algorithmic attention spans, not assembled out of recycled tropes and empty spectacle. It felt like somebody genuinely wanted to tell this story. And honestly, at the end of the day, I think that's all I really ask from cinema. Tell me a story honestly, whether it's in my language or another language, whether it's made in Hollywood, Mumbai, Hong Kong, Seoul, or somewhere else entirely. Just let me feel that somebody cared enough to build a believable human world. And that's what this film gave me. Yes, sometimes I go to the movies for spectacle. Sometimes I go for awe, action, humor, or visual excess. But underneath it all, what I really love are stories. And Cold War 1994 gave me a world that felt complete enough that I wasn't ready to leave it. In fact, by the time I walked back to my car, I found myself already wanting to go back and watch the earlier films connected to this story. Not because I fully understand every political detail or cultural reference, but because I understood the world emotionally. And once a film creates a world you emotionally understand, curiosity takes over. You want to stay there a little longer. And tomorrow night, I'll be sitting in another packed theater, this time inside a Vietnamese love story. Meet me at the Eclipse, surrounded by people emotionally connected to a language and culture I'm still learning through cinema. And honestly, I can't wait.